Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. We carry out our work on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My name is Joyce Wan, Marketing and Digital Production Coordinator at the Fest, and I'm delighted to share the following conversation with Nadifa Mohamed and Nathan Harris, moderated by John Freeman. This event was recorded live at our flagship festival in Vancouver on October 20th, 2022. Mohamed and Harris are the authors of historical novels epic in both scope and power, speaking to injustice and the prevailing human spirit in spite of it. John Freeman is the founder of the literary annual Freeman's and a longtime friend of the festival.
Hi, good evening. Welcome. My name is John Freeman. I'll be your moderator and introducer tonight. It's such a pleasure to be back here in Vancouver, and in particular to be here with you for this event. I think we're living in interesting times. I think everyone maybe thinks that in their own times, but one of the reasons why our time is so interesting, I think, is that it is engaged constantly with history. History is coming back in many, many different ways. And yet we have this problem with history, which is that the archives that we use to tell history are distorting. For example, if you want to tell a story about someone in the United States, you're often using census, you're using property records, you're using voting records, and automatically that will immediately move certain people out of the story of American life. And so what do you do when you end up with erasures and distortions in history as a result of the archives? Well, the two novelists who are here tonight have come up with their own creative historical novels to address areas where history was either distorted or if it was simply missing because it was not recorded well enough to be told. Let me tell you a little bit about the writers who are here, but first let me tell you a little bit about where we are. As you know, that we're having this event on unceded Coast Salish territory. Is of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations people. Nadifa Mohamed and Nathan Harris will be signing books. And I encourage you to buy them. Nadifa has come all the way from London to talk to us. And Nathan Harris has come all the way from Seattle, which, as you know, is extremely different from Vancouver. But I'm especially happy that the two of these writers are put together. Their books are both, to some degree, about freedom. They're both about the violences of the creation of freedom and the taking of freedom away. They're both books that are set in between days, in the sense that Nathan Harris's novel, The Sweetness of Water, is set 10 days after General Robert E. Lee surrenders the Confederacy. And as a result, Union soldiers are moving throughout Southern America. And in a small town called Old Ox, Georgia, and this is 1865, Union soldiers are essentially freeing slaves in real time. And the book opens when a white pacifist farmer named George Walker is walking in the woods behind his house, and he comes upon two black men, brothers, who have been freed. And they're cold, wet, they're hungry, they've been trapping animals. And suddenly, in this interaction, some possibility comes about. Nadifa Mohamed's novel, The Fortune Men, is set in a very different time, but it's also a time of massive change. This is 1952, Cardiff Bay, Wales, Tigers Bay, Cardiff, Wales. It's a time when diversity was to be taken for granted because it was one of the most diverse ports in the world of Jamaican, East African, and Eastern European workers and sailors who would come there. The book focuses on the story of Mahmoud Matan, who was a Somali sailor who moved to Wales to follow work, fell in love, had a wife and family, who was a bit of a petty criminal, often not someone to be relied upon. And in March of 1952, he was framed for a murder he did not commit. And the novel follows the story of Mahmoud's life as it goes from, here's this murder that has happened in the city where I live. They can't possibly be meaning to pick me up because I obviously didn't do it, to suddenly he is the target of the police investigation, and he's picked up and put in jail, and before he knows it, his life has run away from him. 1952, the British Empire was unraveling, and there's a lot of change happening in Wales, and in Cardiff, and in Tigers Bay. And I think what we see in these two novels is the way to tell a story into historical lacunae, and to look at figures who were caught up in times that were somewhat bigger than them. And what's so magical about both of these books is that these writers have managed to take them and return them to human scale, to the human body, if you will. The Sweetness of Water was a Booker long-listed title. It was shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Carnegie Medal for fiction, and it won the Ernest Gaines Award for fiction. Nadifa Mohamed's The Fortune Men, as you probably know, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, the Costa Prize, and it won the Welsh Book Award. It is Nadifa's third novel. We'll talk a bit about the other two that preceded it, but she's come a long way. She's awake, amazingly, and please join me in welcoming her and Nathan Harris to the stage to talk to us about history.
Hey, everybody.
All right, well, welcome. Why don't we just jump right in? And I want to, as I mentioned in my intro, Nathan, your book is set 10 days after Lee surrenders. In 1865. We're in a kind of fictional town in Georgia, in rural Georgia. Nadifa, your book is set 1952 in Wales. Can you tell us how you think about and how you regard the period of history in which your book is set, and you can define that as narrowly, as broadly as you like.
Yeah, I think as someone writing fiction, I'm looking for periods of time where there is tension, that can propel a narrative, but also a period of time where, for me, I wanted to find a time when people of different races, different classes were clashing. And I felt like that gave me a good entry point to explore what America is going through right now, but kind of through a place of distance, I want to give the reader some distance from, what's going on in the world, but also think about it in a different way. So putting it in Reconstruction, I think they're still dealing with all the things we're dealing with right now in terms of, again, of race and class, but a different lens of it. So that's what drew me to it, and I just kind of expanded from there.
Nathan Harris's book is set during this time period, and in addition to George Walker running onto these two brothers, Landry and Prentice, he has a son of his own, Caleb, who's been off fighting. And I think, I don't want to give away too much, but there's loss everywhere, essentially. And he's drawn to these two young men, in part because he's facing an unconscionable, an unimaginable loss, possibly, as are everyone in the town. 1 in 5 or so Southern men were killed during the Civil War. And the returning Confederate soldiers had no work. Many of them, they were broke, they were wounded. And so I think one of the things I want to ask you about is, how did you recreate the different ways that people were suffering? And why did you focus that broadly? Because it could have been just the three of the people I introduced as we began tonight, George and the two brothers. But the book opens out, and you see all these different ways that the war has taken from people.
I think I wanted to start with those three, but I realized at a point when I'm trying to tell this story about this community of Old Ox, I couldn't limit it to that. And it goes back to that idea of, having empathy for your characters and having empathy for whoever enters the story to humanize them in some way. Well, those Confederate soldiers are a part of that. And there's a lot of villains in this book and a lot of people I care about. And you reach this strange point as an author where you find yourself having to care about people in a way that you kind of hate, and that's a very odd moment. But you have to dig into it, and that's hard to dig into, but you have to do it. And I think that's the only way to make it real. And I think on some level, I felt like, well, readers follow me there to empathize with, racists or what have you. But I think they're willing to, because even if you don't want to connect with these people on an emotional level, on some level, you have to in order to confront the past.
Nadifa, 1950s Britain, not necessarily the happiest time, but you did find a pocket of Britain where you and I would have probably felt more comfortable than anywhere else, wandering around the streets. How did you feel about this time period? And when you started to learn more about not just Cardiff, but Tigers Bay and where Mahmoud Matan was working and living, how did it change how you felt about what had happened to him?
Hello, everyone. So I fell in love, I think, with Tiger Bay, especially in this time period. Post-war, the deep increase in people coming from the empire, as it still was at the time, mixing a lot of young men from all over the world and rebellious young British women finding each other and setting up home, creating families against the wishes of a very broken and authoritarian country, society. The music was fantastic. The food looks like it was very good. And Mahmoud was this kind of 1950s character. I think you see him a lot in America. This person, he didn't fight, he wasn't in the Second World War, but he'd walked across Africa during that whole period and then ended up in Cardiff in 1947. So he was a man full of experience, but arriving in Britain without really speaking any English, without knowing how to read or write, and having a different attitude to his superiors, whether that was on the ships or on land, than he was expected to. So Mahmoud was a man who was already challenging authority. He wasn't political in an obvious way in comparison to some of the others, but I think deep down he was saying black is beautiful, and to say that in 1950s Cardiff was problematic.
Describe a bit more. I mean, you've got some photographs from the time period, and you went deep into sort of the fashion of that period. What kind of figure would he have cut walking across town?
I was thinking about this recently, and in a way he reminds me of the third incarnation of, is it Little, in Moonlight, when he's got the grill on and he's got the muscles and he's this armored person. And Mahmoud was armored with clothes. He looked really good. And one of the people I spoke to was an elderly Nigerian watchmaker who had known him and had a physical fight with him in the 1950s. And the first thing he said about him was, he looked good. He had to get that out of the way. So even amongst men who took their style and their self-representation very seriously, my father was also like that. He was an extreme case of that. And I wonder how much resentment that caused amongst people, amongst other men.
Your father was a dandy.
He was, big time, big time. So they would spend a lot of their income on looking good. Three-piece suits, pocket chains, silk ties, all sorts of different hats, sharp shoes. And it's a form of resistance. It's a form of, you'll try and degrade me, or I have a job which is degraded, but look at how I dress. Mm-hmm. You can't conquer me. I'm young and I'm beautiful.
He had a very, very strenuous job as a stoker. And
yes.
Can you describe what that was?
Yes, so he had arrived in Britain as a stoker, as my father did. So they worked in the engine rooms of the steamships across the oceans, the British ships in particular, the British lines. And they were responsible for firing the coal in the furnaces that would keep the boilers and keep the whole ship moving. So they were crucial. but it was a incredibly hard job. I think I didn't realize while I was writing The Fortune Men just how hard it was. And I recently read a report into the injuries and the potential ways of dying doing that kind of work. So there was potential gas explosions. If you were in the coal bunkers, sometimes the coal collapsed on people. People got heat exhaustion, heat stroke beside the furnace. It was 4 hours, I think, at a stretch, and they decided at some point that maybe having black skin, darker skin would protect you from heat exhaustion, or at least protect them from caring about your heat exhaustion. So they started employing Yemeni men, Somali men, Bengali men across that worst route, which was around the equator. They would generally be going from the UK to India, the Far East,
around
and
the Horn
Australia.
of Africa.
Yes, yeah, past there.
You know, both of your books recreate the intense, strenuous damage that was done to the body through the labor that your characters were doing. In Mahmoud's case, paid. In the case of some of your characters, unpaid. And when we first meet the brothers, you know, when we see them from the outside, from George Walker's wife, she can see the dirt under one of their fingernails. And Nathan, your book is beautifully embodied. There's this intense cosmos of sensual impressions that the reader is constantly bathed in. And so you're never unaware that these are people who are living in bodies that have been abused, that have been whipped, that still yearn to call upon your imagination or research.
Yeah, no. To speak to the first part of what you were saying, you have to find this balance, I feel like, of making sure you're not letting the reader forget the trauma of what they went through. And again, that is through description or what have you. But from the first time you meet them in the forest, they just want to have a moment to themselves. That's what they tell George, who owns the land that they're on. We're just trying to rest, literally, and not think about anything. So I wanted to focus on both the trauma, but also the idea of Black joy that these characters could have, you know, at the same time, and the dreams they have and the things they want to do. But again, also bringing that back to, you know, seeing the dirt under their fingernails, the real tangential facts of how hard their life has been and how hard it will be to overcome that to achieve what they want to. In terms of research, you know, you have to honor the people who actually, you know, went through that, the freed men and freed women. And I made sure to do to the best of my ability, find out as much as I could about that. And again, talking about the balance, the story and the characters that you create do have to be prioritized in some way. But again, every line I wrote, I had in my mind, you know, don't forget the past, don't forget those real people as well. So that's a hard, you know, line to walk on, but I did my best with it.
Colson Whitehead, who was here a couple years ago when the Underground Railroad came out, said, maybe not here, but in other capacities, that he had to actually take things out in order to make some of the early passages of that novel believable, because some of the things were so sadistic. And one of the things I find so wondrous and alluring about your book is we have seen so many stories about antebellum American life that when George comes upon, and we don't know quite at that time what year it is, the two brothers in the woods, we think they're going to run, and instead they have a conversation. And when he comes back and at first they help George back to his land because he's kind of having spells and falling down, and it is a completely unexpected interaction. And then he says, you know what, I kind of want to clear some of this land. And Landry's like, you know, we just got done with that experience and we're not looking to have another boss. And when Nadifa was talking about Mahmoud and his attitude, it resonated with the posture that Landry has. And I wonder if you can talk about recreating that posture historically, because what unites your two books is that they both exist in this time period of kind of possibility, which was followed by a brutal aftermath. And I wonder, like, when you're carving open that moment of possibility, what are your what are your models, you know?
I guess I don't have models. I just have my imagination. And I think when I started writing the book, that first scene in the woods when George comes upon them, the power dynamics were so interesting to me. You have this man who owns the land. During that time period, of course, he has power over them, just being a white man. But he's alone, you know, and there's two of them. And he sees them as this physical threat at first. He doesn't know any better in a way. And in my mind, I just sort of wondered, how would that go? And then when he asked them for help out of this place of just thinking he is just helping them, he doesn't recognize from his place of privilege that these two people have been through so much. And why would they want another master in a way? You know, and I think,
you know, he had no control over.
And George didn't realize that was a possibility because he doesn't have to think about that, you know? So that's at the core of what this novel is in a way. And I wanted to present that to the reader.
They also have, as a one thing that gives them powers, they have knowledge. They have knowledge of what to do to clear a landscape. And George wants to become a peanut farmer. Yeah. He's like an early Jimmy Carter.
I thought of that one.
And Landry knows what to do. And George has never really fully worked because he's come from the north. Both of your books are about migration in a way. And George has come from the north to make his fortune, and his family has, but he has no knowledge about how that was made. And yet these two guys know how to do what he needs.
Yeah. They know the real labor that goes into it, and he sort of has this passion project because he's lost his son. So yeah, again, you have these two young freed slaves helping him, and he doesn't know the first thing about it. And again, in some way that equalizes the power, but really it doesn't. And one of the things I grappled with in the book was, you know, is George just a selfish person? And when I started writing it, that was the question that came to mind. Is he just grieving over the loss of his son and these two people can help him through that? Or does he really care about them? And I want people to read it to find out. Like, you know, they can take their own interpretation from it. But, you know, that was always on my mind during all of these moments that we're discussing.
Yeah, the envy is a big part of this book to some degree, like subtle forms of envy. You know, the soldiers coming home without work, and here's George employing two freedmen. And the conversation about how could you possibly employ these people, and that's the word that they would have used, these people, when our boys are coming home without jobs. And that's something that's slightly happening as well within in Mahmoud's story.
Very much so. That resentment was a big deal, and sailors from the colonized parts of the world coming to work in Britain were faced with that resentment from their fellow British white workers, from the unions that were meant to be protecting them, that they were paying to look after their interests. In 48, I think 2,000 Chinese-born sailors were deported. They were rounded up and sent home, forcibly sent back to Hong Kong by the government because they'd asked for equal wages to British soldiers. And they were not allowed to talk to their families, to explain what had happened, put in the cargo holds of these ships and just deported. So that conflict, that one about labor, about money.
So what made the police force an extension of the enforcement of that conflict? As in the police force grew into the vacuum that was needed to police what was actually happening legally.
There's a fantastic book called, it's got two different titles. One of them is got an offensive word in the title, and it's Nationality Wog. And it's about a man named David Oluwale, who also arrived in Britain in 1947 from Nigeria. He was a stowaway. And he ended up being tortured by the police in Leeds. He had both mental health issues and physical health issues and was homeless, and they harassed him over a period of time and eventually chased him into a canal, or maybe even pushed him into a river, sorry, not a canal, where he was found dead 2 weeks later. And one of the terms that's used about the police over a much longer period of time is night soil men, that they're there to take away the human waste of the streets, on the streets. So that could be defined in many ways, but the racial waste, the people that are perceived as being pollutants, contaminants, of having no worth, and all of the racial science was growing at the same time as criminology. So this idea of people's proclivities, their culture, their genes, is a big part of it.
And human zoos are becoming popular at the same time.
Yeah, and the language that's used about Mahmoud in his court case by his own barrister, his defense barrister, is that he's a semi-civilized savage. And that's a term that's part of the whole spectacle of human zoos, that you're there to understand the savage and see how you, as a white civilized Christian European, is so different to the savage. But the interesting, I'm working on human zoos, and one of the characters, Berlin, in the novel has spent time in a German human zoo. And, they were not called human zoos at the time. They were Volker shows, they were people shows. And they were there to define the differences between people. But what they also did was show how people were not very different. And one of the funny things is actually how many women in Germany and Britain, how many cases of women being banned from human zoos happened because they kept trying to have relationships with the men on inside the other part of on the other side of the wall. So it created this moment of, friction, of desire, as well as of violence.
Mahmoud, let's go back to when before he's picked up. He does not feel like they're looking for him.
No, because he knows he's innocent.
And can you describe a little bit about how long that plays out in your novel? Because your novel was playing, when it came out, it was rolling into the post-Brexit Britain, just cluster, you can feel that end of that word, but also the kind of ongoing protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd.
Yes.
And so I think it was a surprise to go back in time to think, here's a murder that happened in a neighborhood, and the African sailor did not think, they're going to pick me up.
No, and the funny thing is, in some ways he was right to think that. It's so strange when you're dealing with these kind of institutional racism, because it's like lightning. You don't know where it will strike. There are quite a few other Somalis who committed murders, sometimes in front of people with a gun. So having a gun is also, it was a more serious crime, and they did not hang. But with Mahmoud, despite the lack of evidence and despite the fact that the police had to concoct so much evidence against him, he did hang. So there was something about him that pulled that lightning towards himself. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to work out in the book, is that it wasn't just because he was black. It wasn't just because he was Somali or Muslim. Other people who were Somali, Muslim, black got away with things. And sometimes that whole language of being a savage was often, the reason the barrister was using it was, you can't ask them to live by our standards. You have to lower your standards so you cannot judge them as harshly. Don't find him guilty. Often they would be found guilty and then they'd be declared unfit, mentally unfit. So they would not hang. They would spend a year in a psychiatric hospital and then be deported. So for Mahmoud to experience this, he was thinking about compensation. He was thinking, well, I know I'm innocent and they're keeping me in jail, so I wonder how much compensation I'd get for a month or 2 months of imprisonment. And each stage he thinks that something will happen to get him out, and everyone will realize their mistake. He's been through the criminal justice system a few times already for petty things. And those experiences, being arrested for stealing and for stealing money from the mosque, which he was found guilty of, have given him this false confidence in the system.
Let's talk about history again in a narrative frame as a novelist. One of the things that you work against is the fact that in both of your frames, you know where the time frame is going to lead to. We know what happened with Reconstruction. We know what Britain became in the 50s and early 1960s, when it became an uglier and uglier place.
And it is now.
And I wonder if you can talk about what it means to make a narrative when you know that the outcome leads you to some place where the possibilities you're opening up will be shut down, and what that does to you in terms of making plot. Because, I don't think it gives anything away, Nathan, with your book to say that there is a murder at the heart of it.
Sure.
That sets other loyalties and bargains in motion, that mean that people have to choose what secrets to keep and what not. And, what does it mean when you're making a plot in a world like this, that that essentially what's going to happen on the end of this time frame are lynchings and Jim Crow and worse?
Yeah. Well, when you were talking, I was just thinking about that false sense of optimism that it seems like he had. And I feel like when I was writing my book, there was a sense of hope for these characters, a sense of optimism that I felt like they must have had, that no matter what they have gone through, the fact that they've survived it, it can only get better, right? And I think the answer to that is, sadly no. But in order to even write a novel during this time period, I was, pretty purposeful, and there was an intent in deciding this period right after Reconstruction, because hope was abound. I mean, the Freedmen's Bureau was enforcing these laws so that, Black individuals could have some level of freedom, and there was no way for them to know what would come in terms of Jim Crow and whatnot. So I think I wanted to present that sense of hope and present their humanity in feeling that. But in doing that, you still can't evade the truth of what is to come. So you have to, include all of that in the narrative. So, I tried to do that.
We were talking on the way over about J.M. Coetzee and in particular his book Disgrace, which exists during a similar time period of possibility that ends up in violence. But I know both of you are also fans of, and who can't be, of Toni Morrison, who I think had a very immensely enlarged idea of how to write historical fiction. And I wonder if either of you could talk a bit about writing in the kind of grand foyer created by her works, and what you took, if anything, from them. I know, Nadifa, you interviewed her, you met her, you watched and talked about reality TV shows with her. So your interaction is a bit more intimate. But do you want to say anything about any of her works that point towards history?
I mean, those are the guiding lights in a way when we're talking about J.M. Coetzee and Toni Morrison. But I mean, the true answer to your question is those shadows are just really big, and in a sense, I really tried to write my work outside of thinking about, I think I'd be too stifled to focus on, those luminaries. So in a sense, you're always paying homage to them, but I just had to work through the darkness myself, and not be overwhelmed by the incredible works that they left. In a way, I'm kind of evading the question in a sense, but it's just too hard to make those connections, and their portfolio of work is so vast, and I just wanted to make my own little imprint in a sense. So
I think you succeeded.
It's all you can do. I don't know.
Yeah, of course. Especially with Toni Morrison, I think the influence is just there. It's floating around. It's not, let me take this idea that she's used or made me think about, but it's just ambient. It's an ambient, I think, influence. And with Coetzee, there's one novel in particular called In the Heart of the Country, which is set in the 19th century in the Karoo Desert. of a woman, Magda, I think her name is Magda, and she's an unreliable narrator. And I think there's a few books, Waiting for the Barbarians, around that time period where he's trying to get at something again and again and again. And there's repetition, sometimes in images. There's often a ballooning skirt, which is like a flower in water and things like that. And being in South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and also that very violent 19th century South Africa as well. And his personhood as a man of European ancestry in that kind of environment. I think he's embracing the role of victimhood, which maybe that's what he needed to do, because in South Africa, he was not the victim. Mm-hmm. So he's constantly trying to get at what it means to be a victim. And in The Diary of Michael Kay, I think that to me is a pure victim. It's a novel that doesn't really work for me because I find him so passive in the face of everything that happens to him. Not to criticize J.M. Coetzee at all. And what I'm interested in, I guess, is people who have enormously painful things happen to them, but are still not victimized. So Seth in Beloved, I think, is someone who's not victimized. You know, she's almost the source of fear for many people in her community because of what she's done. And with Mahmoud, he was a difficult man. He was not someone, I think, that was easy to get along with. He was not violent, but I think he was full of bluster. And by the stage that we meet him in 1952, his life has kind of collapsed. He's lost his wife, they're legally separated, they're not living together, he's in and out of work, he's living in a boarding house with these men that don't like him, he's alienated from the Muslim community because he just stole money from the mosque. His life is on the edge. So when everything does happen to him, he's a complicated character for everyone to rally around. Mm.
You do have a lot of solo actors in your work. You know, the
loners.
Loners, yeah. You're very good at loners. And you know, the Black Mamba Boy is the story of an orphan, you know, wandering the entirety of Africa practically, in search of a father. And your second novel is a soldier very much alone and some of the bargains that she's made. And now we have Mahmoud. And in some ways, you're tracing and arcing an alternate but similar route through East African histories and migration to Abdul Razak Gurnah.
Yeah, he likes loners as well.
Who recently won the Nobel Prize and was your first gateway into publishing.
Yeah.
And I wonder, because, you know, when you hear that someone has won a Nobel Prize, you think of them as sort of sitting on a mountain with a bunch of stone tablets and endless amounts of cranberry juice or something.
Is that not the case?
Yeah.
No?
But what was your interaction like?
I was with him very recently. I was with him 2 weeks ago as well at a book festival in Nairobi. So he hasn't changed. He's exactly the same. And he reminds me of one of my uncles. And in Nairobi, we were arguing about Islamic inheritance laws. So it's very familial. And I found him, I was reading a lot of his work when I was working on Black Mamba Boy. And he was the only person really that was writing about the world that I was trying to get at, which is not just Somalia, but also these port cities, these coastal communities, whether that's Zanzibar, whether that's Aden, whether that's Djibouti, these places that no one really cares about, but are fascinating and old and layered and meeting places for various continents. So I really saw something familiar in his work, and he invited me over when he was still teaching at the University of Kent, and he read the very first, I think, 30 pages that I'd written. And a lot of those 30 pages are still in that first chapter of Black Mamba Boy. And I remember him saying that my character, Jama, who was based on my father, was spoilt. And I was like, how can you call a street boy spoilt? But he was right. And there was something kind of entitled about him. So that we don't pull punches with each other. I think that's that's very familiar from my background, that you just say things how they are.
I'm bringing up sort of kinship, if you will, literary kinship and fictive kinship, as in the sort of chosen family of writers who've helped you realize that you can make the world that you have made in fiction. And I say that not simply to say that everyone who writes a book has to feel entitled or is given the kind of tap of the sword in which they are allowed at that point to then sit down at the computer and write their book. But I think when we talk about history, when we talk about books that reimagine or open up periods of history that have been occluded, I can't help but bring up the kind of chosen family of writers, if you will. Partly, I guess, in Nathan, in your case, because you grew up in Ashland, Oregon, and this book is set in the Deep South. It might be that your family has roots there, but I'm curious what kind of other than your own imagination, if there was someone at some point who sort of tapped you on the shoulder or took you aside or looked at your work as it was growing and said, yeah, more, please, or less of this and do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the easy answer to that is, of course, I always had professors who were saying, this is good work, keep going with it. But I think any writer is going to look toward, again, those writers who came before them, and for me, like James McBride, The Good Lord Bird, he wrote this book that was just, he's a jazz musician and his books read like jazz, and he'll write historical fiction where just the zaniest things happen. Frederick Douglass shows up and is acting like this, like comedian almost, and this womanizer, and just doing crazy stuff. And just little things like that made me feel like, well, you can just do whatever you want in a way, and you don't have to worry about how it's going to be received or that you're doing it in the wrong way. You can just do whatever you want. And that's permission, and that's permission from, your elders in the literary world. And that's the sort of thing that keeps me going. When you bring up J.M. Coetzee, even just on a prose level, there's just little things like in an MFA program, don't repeat words. He'll repeat a word whenever he wants. He'll make a sentence that's crazy, and it kind of feels lazy, but it's not lazy, it's concise. And I don't know, every time I read a sentence like that or read a book like The Good Lord Bird, that reinvigorates me. That tells me, keep going. No matter what you're doing it your way, and they did it their way, and you will connect with the readers because, you have the confidence. You should have the confidence they have, and that will come across. So
you brought up something that I think often, at least as a common conception of historical fiction, which is, that they're sort of whale fat powered gas lamps and, Charles Dickens with a watch fob, and Thomas Edison will take a train through town and wave at people, and one of the things that's really remarkable about your book relies on none of that. Lee is mentioned in passing, certain events are mentioned in passing, but by and large, everyone in this book is completely made up. And I wonder if that was a deliberate decision on your part in terms of what it gave you by way of freedom to imagine.
Yeah, I think I spoke on that a little bit before, but I think my project here, and again, I didn't know if it would work at all, was in a sense to write a modern novel that's set in the past. And I was willing to take on any sort of claim that, this is ahistorical, this is wrong. Okay, maybe. But I think there's something to be taken from these characters who I do feel like they are set in their time period. I do feel like they are one with that time, but at the same time, they're dealing with these very modern issues, and again, history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And by creating this thread that goes from the past to the current over and over again and repeated, I feel like I wanted to create this rhythm and this pattern that the readers would connect with, and I don't know if it was successful. I like to hope so.
Were you keeping an eye on the present as you were finishing this book, Nadifa? Because it did take 10 or 12. I know you had that idea almost 20 years ago, but in terms of the composition and research, more than 10 years.
It was off and on. And then I really started in earnest in 2015, going to Cardiff, reading the case file in the National Archives in London, going to Hargeisa to interview people there. And I finished it. I finished the first draft in 2017. And then I sat on it for a while, got back to it, started editing. So everything, one of the things that maybe took me by surprise with the protests that happened after George Floyd's murder was this has been going on all the time. You know, I think in the UK, in the US, in Canada, in lots of different places, this is not unusual. So why now? why this sudden outpouring? Because there are so many people that we should have had this outpouring for. And I think there was something particularly brutal about that video. But when you're writing, you're kind of in this bubble, and I was still in that bubble and thinking about the past rather than the present. But when the book was published, there was this audience that was interested in talking about institutional racism and violence, not just in this purely historic way, but also in its connections between the present and the past. But I can think of every decade, every year of cases in the UK and in the US that I found horrific and were probably the fire behind the novel as a whole, not just Mahmoud's story, but the entirety of all of this violence.
Go ahead.
I mean, I would just say, yeah, it's strange to have people say that the novel is timely in a way when it's like, well, this could come out in 2 years and it'll be timely because there'll be the next one, you know, the next case. It keeps going on. So these stories need to keep being told, you know.
Yeah.
We were talking about sort of putting actual figures in books, putting actual time markers, putting actual events. Nadifa, you put almost the entirety of the transcript of the trial in your book.
Yeah,
you know,
it's one part of it.
You know, it's quite a chunk, and I wonder if you can talk a bit about that decision, about putting something that literal in a piece of fiction.
Yes, I think I'm a nerd. I studied history and politics at university. I didn't study literature or creative writing. So I think what animates my fiction is what I'm learning, which is what is considered fact, what is considered history. And there's something about touching that case file, seeing where Mahmoud signed his name. He didn't really know how to read or write, but he could sign his name. That very arcane way that Britain sometimes still, but very much in the 1950s, operates within. So that really brought everything to life for me. And that transcript of the court case was shocking. It reads like a play. The barristers are these very hammy kind of orators who use this very florid language. There's a lot of comedy, there's a lot of humor in it. One of the prosecution witnesses is this woman called May Gray, who has a hearing aid, and whenever the defense barrister asks her a difficult question, she pretends it's not working, and he calls her out on it, and then also calls her out on the fact that she only came forward after the reward was put forward. So there's this back and forth, and then Mahmoud takes the stand, and his time on the dock is just terrible, and you just think, oh my God, he's made life so much worse for himself. Even when there are alibis or people who put him somewhere beyond the shop where the murder takes place, he says, I'm not going to talk about that. I don't feel like I need to talk to you about that. That's between me and my wife. So you just want to shake everyone, and you can't believe that this is the real account of someone being found guilty of a murder they didn't commit and then executed for it. But that's what it is, you know. And The Good Lord Bird is also about history as farce, and I think history can be farce. And I'm not writing it in the present, you know. I'm writing it 70 years after all of this took place, but it felt very present to me. And Mahmoud is this 20-something-year-old man who just can't believe that they would destroy him. You know, he doesn't know his end. I know his end, but he doesn't know his end. And even to the last minute, he's thinking that something will happen. God will save him. He's praying to God.
It's such a peculiar and unique tension to a novel I've ever read, in the sense that what produces the tension is not knowing what's going to happen. It's you knowing and him not knowing.
Yeah.
Which produces a very unique kind of sympathy.
And then you stop believing that it will happen.
Yes.
Because he doesn't believe it will happen.
Yeah, I think magically you think, you know, something else will happen.
Yeah, and the transcript is about the fiction, the official fiction, because it is fiction. And very recently, in September of this year, South Wales Police finally apologised to his family for that miscarriage of justice. But it was an obvious miscarriage of justice right there and then that Mahmoud could tell what was, eventually he works out, it's because I'm black. It's because my life is cheap. Okay, I get it now. But that's in the few days before he dies.
Nathan, in your book, there's all these sort of spaces of possibility that are kept open a little longer than you think until they kind of slightly implode. One of them very much becomes the source of a lot of the tension. And those are the sort of erotic spaces. There's two Confederate soldiers who are having a gay relationship. There's sex workers who are in town. One of the main characters goes to one, and I don't know if I believe this, but he's like, she just listens to me when I talk. And I think those spaces hold open possibility longer. They add types of possibility that I wonder if you can say something more about.
What do you mean by types of possibility?
Well, there's a really wonderful book by a South African journalist whom you might know, who mapped the party circuit of gay South Africa under apartheid, and in which black and white gay men could get together. You'll know his name, and if I keep talking,
Is it Rian Mallon?
No, definitely not. But anyway, one of the things that was so fascinating about that book is it created a psychogeography of sexual possibility that resisted the dominant lack of possibility of a racialized state. And I think to some degree, that happens. The sex worker that George goes to talk to is black, and she's kind of a fantasy version of the slave girl that he grew up with. And similarly, the gay relationship that's happening in the book, those are two white men, but it alters, it comes in and it throws a wrench into what you can expect out of these escalating intensities.
Yeah. I remember somebody at my publisher, they actually asked me, why do you have this gay relationship in the book? Which, I don't know, it seems kind of a strange question, but I guess to me the answer was because we haven't really explored that enough, in historical fiction, and especially during this time period. I mean, that was happening, and I tried to, read as much as I could about it, but there wasn't that much about it. But again, we go back to this idea of hope and this idea of trying to just find connections during a time that's so rife with darkness. And these are just people who are desperate to find somebody to connect with. And George has this with Clementine, And again, we go back to this strange power dynamic where he does think of her as this slave that his parents owned earlier in his life. And he has no idea how she feels about it, but it's worth it to him, and she's willing to play this role. And in terms of that or the two gay soldiers, I do want it to come off as there's some level of true connection to it, while the reader has the detachment to see that nothing really can come from this because you're going to be suppressed at some point. These people are going to be stopped. They're not allowed to have this at this time, in history. So
I think what's unique about both of your books in the realm of historical fiction, because they're literary novels set historically rather than historical novels per se, is that the gap between characters' roles and who they are is played with. It elasticates and then is drawn to a close. That in the sense that you can say that I'm only playing the role of the person who's been picked up for this crime until you are actually hung. Then you are the role. It doesn't matter if there's a gap. If you think there's a gap, you have become the role that has been assigned to you. And you've described in the past that that's why you put the transcript in there. Because what happens over the course of that transcript is a individual enters a courtroom, and by the end of it, he has become the role assigned to him. Yeah. And he refuses to play. And I think that is something that happens across the course of your book as well, in heartbreaking and tragic ways.
I found hearing about that to be fascinating. It almost sounds like his dignity and his idea of himself was just overriding all of these social pressures, you know. And again, the way that you were able to dig into the psychology of that character, that's fascinating to me. So good job there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Also, the men that I grew up with. My father was a sailor. He knew Mahmoud, and my father had a much harder upbringing than Mahmoud Matan. So his survival instincts were much more attuned. He would not have done many of the things that Mahmoud had done. You know, Mahmoud sees the police and he says, "Oh, you're all liars. You're all racists." My father would have known not to do that. So it's kind of the anti-father. It's who you know, there's a heroism to him, but it's a heroism that's part of a sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for a world where he can be this man just of dignity.
We're at about an hour, and I think it's time to ask if you have any questions for Nathan Harris or Nadifa Mohamed. I'm not sure if there's a mic or not. We're in such a cozy theater here. I think you could probably whisper them. So don't fart. That's the cheap joke. Anybody have a question? Yes.
For Nathan, I wanted to know, did you tour the southern states with this book?
The question is, did Nathan tour the southern U.S. states with this book?
No. No, I did not tour the southern states. I would have loved to if I had the time and financial capability to do that. But it's a hard thing when the idea strikes you. And like I was saying, this town part of the reason I created a town was I didn't want to have an event like this in the South where someone goes, you know, well, the two streets actually don't align that way. Oh, you're wrong. So I created sort of this mythical space for these characters to come together. And at that point, again, you just try to do the research and you try to do justice to what did take place. And you know, there's a lot of great oral histories that were recorded by historians that I could read online. And if you spend enough time with these freed men and women, you can feel like you're there in a sense. And every morning I just try to wake up and read a bit about it and kind of find myself back in there. And I just kind of cross my fingers and hope that it didn't come across as a totally fraudulent document that I was created. So I did not go, no.
Can I ask a question? Did you read the Freedom Writers Project, Federal Writers Project, interviews with freed men and women?
I think that's exactly what I read. It was a very strange thing where I believe it was that. I read it, and then I had the idea, and I said, you know what, I'm going to stop for a moment, and I took a step back, and I started outlining, and, you know, I found other documents, and I get that question on occasion, and I think that was the kernel that started the entire process for my work.
Do you want to say what those that project was?
I'm not American. I feel like an American should say.
No, please.
It was a project that grew out of the Great Depression to employ writers, journalists, map makers, musicians, all sorts of different people. So writers were sent to different places to write about those places. So Claude McKay wrote about New York, Manhattan, and a group of others went south, and they interviewed people who were in their 80s and 90s who'd lived through slavery. And mostly it's written, but there are a few recordings, and there's one on YouTube of a man named Fountain Hughes, and you can hear his voice and hear the interview. It's really incredible. And he talks about that period straight after emancipation when they're just waiting. They've got nowhere to sleep. They're sleeping on the road. They're scavenging for food. And that period of time, which, you know, in theory should be so jubilant, was actually just this slack, open time.
Strange
It
time.
is.
Yeah. And yeah, one of the documents that I read, it was just their owner just open the gate. You're like, you can go, you can stay, whatever you want to do. And that was the question that haunted me when I was writing this. I mean, I don't know what I would do. This is my whole life. You know, your whole life, your whole identity is caught up in, you know, this routine that has been forced upon you. And this is all you know. This is your, for better or for worse, this is your safety place. Or you can go and, you know, find your own path. And some stayed and some went. And I tried to explore that in my novel.
Yeah.
The federal government must have been incredibly weak at the time in the sense, and was there any kind of nationalized mechanism for implementing the Emancipation Proclamation?
Sure, yeah. And in the book, the Freedmen's Bureau is there, and that was the government's tool to have these soldiers pretty much occupy these towns in the South and make sure that these freed people are getting treated fairly. But a lot of these soldiers didn't care about these individuals beyond just following their orders. So it creates this other layer of strange tension where you have these soldiers walking through this town. And of course, the returning Confederate soldiers despise them. You know, they're the interlopers. And everybody still has sort of a contempt to the freed people. So that it's again a very strange time for these African Americans to overcome all these obstacles and these individuals and find their way in the United States.
Any other questions? Yes, in the front row here.
Are you working on other historical novels at the moment? Either of you?
I am. I'm working on my second novel, unrelated to The Sweetness of Water, but it's set during the same time period. I would say the tone's similar, trying to explore some, concepts in history that haven't really been explored enough in my mind. But beyond that, I can't share too much. If you share it, it freezes in the air and it breaks. So I got to keep it to myself. But hopefully you can be reading it soon.
I'm working on something, sort of, and it's sort of.
I published this book. I'm waiting for it wasn't
First
sort of a month ago.
Sometimes it's sort of, but it's contemporary. But the more I'm thinking about it, it's about the Somali Civil War, which happened from the late 80s into the early 90s. But it goes forward, and I think maybe it goes back as well to a degree. So it's not historical in the same way that The Fortune Men is, but it's maybe a more roaming novel.
Is this the first you're hearing? This is an intimate editor.
This is the first I'm hearing of the return, because Nadifa, I think, is under pressure to some degree because everyone loves you in London. She's one of the most liked, as you can tell, lovely persons, and I think everyone wants you to write this kind of only London novel. But I think that's a very London pressure, because I think the people that live in a world in which only London exists or are a very particular kind of person.
Yeah.
Some of them just recently left number 10 Downing Street.
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm attracted to places in conflict and in places of points of collapse. I live in one now. So it's a different equation.
It must be very strange for both of you to have been in these cones of historical research and intensity, the sort of enchantment that you have to produce to keep staying in yourselves, and then to come out of it and constantly into states of chaos. I mean, the America that was, 2019 America was just, it was bonkers. I mean, it's always been pretty bonkers, but it was especially on the nut job case then.
I mean, related, I was going to ask you if, stepping into the past, was it exhausting for you? Because I found it to be sort of exhausting to constantly be in this, kind of traumatic period of time, Yeah. And I wonder if you felt that too. And then again, coming out of it and being in a traumatic time currently.
No, maybe. So, no, I loved this. I loved writing this novel.
Yeah.
It wasn't, the others were difficult, but this one was not difficult. And because I was in Mahmoud's mind, he didn't know what was going to happen to him. So most of it was not a difficult or upsetting thing to write. You're just immersed in this young man's life, which is really exciting, lived on this grand scale across the world. He's got the freedom of being a young man. So I really enjoyed entering that state of mind. But yes, everything since then, everything in the real world has been difficult. And that's probably why I'm saying I'm kind of writing, because how can you write when you don't know what's going on around you? The government keeps collapsing. There's war, there's famine, there's drought, there's everything going on at the same time.
I guess I try to find solace in the idea that, in the past, there's always going to be these things happening. Like I was saying, the past echoes. And the job, I guess I think of my job as sitting down at my laptop and trying to just put my blinders on. And the only thing I can give people really is an escape for a little while, and that's my little contribution. So I try to focus on that.
But I think historical fiction is also an escape for us, because you're dealing with something which is not chaotic. For all of its evil and good, it's stable, it's contained, and you can enter it without fear in a way, because you can always return to, it's like time traveling, you can return to your bed and everything is fine again. And while trying to write about the contemporary world is much more intimidating.
I feel that way. I haven't done it yet. So yeah.
I'm trying for the first time.
Yeah, good for you. I'm gonna get there eventually, and it'll be a new experience.
Yeah.
There's a question right there. Yes.
For both of you, while you were writing your books, did you know what the title was going to be, or did the title change, and how did you decide on it?
I don't start with a title. It's funny. One of my teachers, Elizabeth the Kraken, at UT, she hates the idea of having a title that comes from the text. Actually, it's kind of like the reader comes upon it and they're like, "Oh yeah, I get it." That. But I've never felt that way. I don't know. Maybe I'm like a kid at heart or something. But when I see it, I'm always like, "Oh my god, that's cool." Yeah, it all makes sense now. So yeah, I wrote a line in the book, and it came from that. And the second I wrote it, it felt right to me, and I put it in there. And Elizabeth and the Kraken, to this day, will bring it up to me when I see her. But I have no regrets.
This novel has had so many titles. For a long time, it was called The Stoker, and I thought that was a nice, clean, simple name, focused on the main character. There's also a short story by Franz Kafka called The Stoker. But eventually, I had a list of 20 potential titles that I hashed through with my UK editor. And The Fortune Men relates to something in my first novel, actually. So not this novel, but the first. And it's a term used from the 1930s, 40s by Somalis about the young men who would go off and join the merchant navy, that they were the fortune men, but both because they could earn relatively a huge amount of money, and also they were men who were throwing themselves into the hands of fate, fortune.
Yes, there's one right here.
Distinction between literary fiction that's set in historical times.
He did.
Historical fiction.
Yes.
I'm interested in that distinction, why you would say that they were different, and whether the authors feel like they're writing historical fiction or literary fiction.
You go first, John.
All right, I'll try to dig myself out of this hole. I think of genres as a container for storytelling, which has a set of conventions which promises to deliver upon them. And so a crime novel, a noir, a romance, they have a series of things that it will repeat when you read them. And part of the pleasure and comfort of reading in genre is having those repetitions and knowing and expecting what they're going to deliver. It may not tell you exactly how the plot's going to unfold, but a Gothic novel is going to have a house, a haunting, some twins, something. And I think there's a certain kind of historical novel, which in itself is a genre. It's a genre of enchantment and escape. And I think it's different from your two books because it is an actual escape from history. I think to some degree, historical fiction often it dovetails with the idea of exceptionalism. You know, that you have sort of exceptional people in historical fiction that live outside of their times, and somehow give us the idea, the possibility that those times could be transcended. And that's something that you're both doing within your own books, but eventually the times catch up with your characters. And I think your books are slightly different, and then you can critique or agree. You can agree or disagree, because you are playing with the conventions of history. You're playing with the roles that characters have, and in some ways, the characters are aware of the roles that are being handed to them and are operating slightly against them.
It's an interesting question, and it makes me wonder. I didn't think of myself as writing a historical novel. That wasn't the aim. But if I was to try and write this story as a historical novel, how would it have changed? What would it look like?
The docks were wet that day. Mahmoud got off the boat. He had some money in his pocket. He was going to spend it.
He'd have one of those big sacks over his shoulder. Yeah, there'd probably be more romance. I think he'd be less abrasive as a character. And it would be less fact-based, because I've tried to really entwine the archival research with my own words. So a lot of the dialogue is actually coming from what Mahmoud is reported to have said in the newspapers, in the police interviews, in the interviews with the prison doctor. So that relationship that I'm playing with, of who's the narrator in it, is something that came from this experiment. It felt, for me, quite experimental.
Mm.
I mean, I think that's more of like a literary criticism question, and I would hate to approach my fiction thinking about that beforehand. I would be fine writing in either of those genres. I want my work to turn out however it is. I mean, to me, I hear you bring up these sort of, I don't know, tropes, I guess. I think you can write a fantastic literary novel with those tropes as well. You know, the book just forms itself how it's going to form itself. And again, part of having those blinders on when I'm sitting down and writing my book is I don't want anything to put me in a box. I want to just follow the story where it goes, and I have an idea where that is. And I just write what I write. You know, I think that's my duty as an author, is to just not worry about that sort of question. But I love that conversation is taking place. I think that's what makes, again, literary criticism thrive. And I want to hear all about that. But as a writer in writing mode, I don't want to have to think about it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
The books are outside. They're beautiful and wondrous and so amazingly well written and researched. I highly recommend you get both, and they will be signed. You can take them home and share them with your friends. Nathan Harris, Nadifa Mohamed, it's been such a pleasure to have you here.
John,
thank you, John Freeman.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, you are. You talked yourself away. That was amazing.
You have been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. To hear more events like this one and view our upcoming events, visit our website at writersfest.bc.ca.